Welcome to Wandering Jews at J Squared Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself. We're your hosts.
I'm Scott Copeland.
I'm Rivka Brahma.
Welcome back. Today on Wandering Jews, Rivka and I are here, and we're going to be visiting a place where scale of space and time shapes our encounter with Jewish life and, of course, Jewish memory. We're going to be visiting the Gensha Cemetery in Warsaw, walking its paths underneath the trees, between the monuments. It's really an impressive sight. It's an overwhelming sight because it is just such an enormous scale of paths and thousands and tens of thousands of graves. But it also is an incredible story because it really does mark the brilliance, the diversity, the Jewish life that existed in Warsaw previous to the Second World War.
So when you presented the idea to me, let's talk about a cemetery, I was like, again, a cemetery? But it's not by accident that in Hebrew we call a cemetery Eretz HaChaim, the land of the living. Sometimes in order to understand the life, we need to go visit the dead. It's a huge cemetery, very, very impressive in size and in variety of tombstones located in Warsaw. Gensha, or Gensha, is located on Okopowa Street. And we often spend quite a lot of time there when we go there with our tours.
I just want to give a sense of that scale. Take an image from people from New York will be familiar with this. You're talking about 80 acres, the Gensha Cemetery. So it's absolutely enormous. So it's about 1/10, more or less, of the size of Central Park. So if you would start at 59th and 5th, and you'd walk past the pond, and you'd circle the Gapstow Bridge, and you keep going to 65th, pretty much once you get to the area around Sheep's Meadow, that's Gensha. But here you're talking about 200 to 300,000 graves covering this area. It's simply enormous. And on that level, it's really, apropos the idea of a land of the living, it is a chance to walk these avenues and to relive what Jewish life was in Warsaw previous to the war, because with all due respect to current Jewish life in Warsaw, what was before the war, it has no comparison. We're talking about a city that was 30% Jewish, where as you walked the neighborhoods, you heard Yiddish. Non-Jews spoke Yiddish newspapers, political organizations, religious denominations or sects. You're talking about an incredible variety of Jewish life. The historical reality is the Second World War cut it off. And so all we can do is essentially visit the cemetery and places like it in order to, the phrase I tend to use, conjure the spirits and tell the stories in order to try to remember.
So Warsaw was always a very big Jewish city, and it stopped at World War II when it was the biggest Jewish city in the world, bringing people to the ghetto from outside of Warsaw. But it started, we know, at around the 1400s when the first Jews started to come to Warsaw, and it became bigger and bigger around the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. That's where we know that there's really a revival, a renaissance of Jewish life, as you said. And again, listen to our podcast about Yiddish. Multiple journals, multiple Yiddish theaters, multiple Hebrew journals as well, a huge community of Litvaks Mitnagdim who are opposed to Hasidism, and on the other hand, people who are ruling their courts of Hasidim as well, people who are struggling with modernity, people who are looking into Zionist ideas, and people who are looking into more international ideas of communism and socialism as well. And they're all represented in this vast cemetery that we're going to walk through.
And the cemetery includes over 200,000 marked graves, and it could be that we're talking about as many as 300,000 graves. Absolutely huge, rivaling many, many large Jewish communities living all over the world today. And so it really is a city of memory.
And, this is where the place where all the Jews met, because in daily life, some of them wouldn't talk to each other or wouldn't be caught dead in the same space. But when you're dead, nobody asks you anymore. Yet there's different sections for different communities, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And there's one interesting space that is actually adjacent to the cemetery, and that's a synagogue that is right when you walk in. It's an interesting synagogue that was created there, and it was mainly used by all the outcasts of Jewish society, the burglars, the criminals, the sex workers, and it's been documented that in Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, it was a very lively scene, but it's just to show you that they felt Jewish and proud of their Jewish heritage, although the Jewish society might have outcasts them, but still they have their own synagogue,
Definitely.
Which is at the cemetery. It's like you're part of us, but not really part of us. So that's an interesting phenomena.
No, and it brings to mind even different writers who lived in Jewish Warsaw before the war. Isaac Bashevis Singer, who we mentioned in an earlier podcast. I'm thinking about different pieces that he wrote about his childhood and growing up in Warsaw before he immigrated to the States. A lot of these characters that you're mentioning, those are the folks who populate his books. Mm-hmm. Not the rich and famous, not the great rabbis, not the outstanding politicians, but like the common folk who were working hard, and some of them in quite questionable trades and professions. But these were the people who, in a lot of ways, he tried to champion. And I think that was part of a kind of an emphasis or an impetus to say, hey, the Jews, you know what? Bottom line, we're just like everybody else.
So when we walk through the cemetery, let's look at a little bit of an index to kind of maybe help us understand who the people here are buried through objects and signs that are there. So you'll see a lot of Magen Davids, right? The Jewish David Star. Again, listen to our podcast about the Jewish Star. So we know that they started using the Jewish Star from the 17th century. We will see two hands holding each other. That is usually the sign if a priest or someone who belongs to a priest family is buried there, because the signing of the blessing of the priest. Again, check out our podcast about Gay Ben Hinnom, where we talk about the priestly benediction.
You might see a picture of two candles.
Again.
And a pair of hands hovering over it.
Mm-hmm.
And usually that'll be connected with a woman, a wife, or a mother, or
a righteous
sister,
woman, right?
Someone who every Friday night would be lighting candles and commemorating that through the symbol on the stone.
Or a hand holding an etzbah for reading the Torah, which usually means that this person was a sofer stam, someone who a scribe who writes Torah books. And there's also some animals like a gazelle, if your name is Hirsch or Tzvi or Naphtali, which are all connected to that name. Or a lion, if you're part of anything that has to do with Leib, is usually associated with a lion. And a dove is usually a young female, and usually a bird is a sign if there's a boy that died prematurely. So that's a little bit of a detective game that we can play when we walk around the cemetery.
Yeah, and as we're walking around, we also, a lot of those symbols, which are very traditional, and definitely people continue to use them in the modern period, the kind of more plain, smaller stones, in this case, a lot of them made out of sandstone, the matzevot, the headstones, they shift and change as people became more modern, more integrated, more enlightened. But, incorporating what was the art of the day and what were the type of monuments that were being erected in neighboring cemeteries in Warsaw that belonged to non-Jews. And so you might see the introduction of, Art Nouveau and neoclassical and some of these actually quite incredible statues and mausoleums and symbolic representations, which when you turn your head for a second and you do that quick double take, you almost say to yourself, wait a second, that belongs in a Jewish cemetery? But part of that is really challenging this whole question of, what's Jewish? What makes something Jewish? And how that changes as time goes by. We know it from our own lives.
It's also a direct fact that people had more money, then they could spend more money on tombstones. But also in Israel right now, we're going through this change or shift where you go into different cemeteries and you see more and more tombstones that look different from one another, much more variated than what we're used to, because people bring on different cultures that they come from. So let's walk through this cemetery and let's talk about a few of its personalities. We chose a few personalities that we want to focus on, mostly because we want you to know about them and they're interesting and we feel that they're inspiring people, but also it's kind of a showcase of how varied and interesting response to Jewish life and to Jewish tradition could be or should be.
It'll be interesting because when you have the opportunity to visit Gensha Cemetery and to walk with your tour educator through the grounds, what will the local Polish guide point to? And what will your Israeli Jewish tour educator point to? It could be 4 totally different people than the people we're mentioning now, and there might be an overlap, and that's worth checking as well. And hopefully as you do the deep dive and learn more about the site, it could be that you'll find people who are particularly interesting to you, maybe even people who are connected with your own family background.
Let's start with one of the earliest tombstones. So even though Jews have been in Warsaw since the 1400s, the first tombstone that we found is for much later than that. One of the reasons is there were several Jewish cemeteries in Warsaw. Sarah bat Eliezer, Sarah, the daughter of Eliezer, that's all we know about her. It's not a famous figure, but we know it's one of the oldest tombstones in the cemetery. She died in 1807. It's a very simple sandstone matzeva, softened by moss, and it's kind of green and looks very much like how you would picture an old tombstone to look at. And she's remembered simply as the modest woman, the daughter of the distinguished Eliezer. That's what we know about her. And maybe that's a sign of how women were perceived in society. You are remembered as the daughter of or the wife of, and the most important trait that you have is being modest. But it's interesting that her name is Sarah, which brings us back and connects us to our matriarch, Sarah. And the fact that we see reoccurrent names all the time throughout the cemetery is also one thing that the Jewish community is very proud of having the same names all the time, sometimes with different add-ons, like Aryeh is Leib and Sarah could be Surale, but it's, there's a line between Sarah Imenu that is buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah in Hebron, which is the first time that we learn about burial and buying burial lands and how we bury people. And this Sarah bat Eliezer from Warsaw.
Another figure who is important to mention, both because he's in the cemetery, but more importantly because of his gigantic legacy, is Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, the Brisker. So those of you who have a sense of the great families who have formed a rabbinic learning and leadership in modern times will be familiar with the name Soloveitchik. You're probably familiar with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, a modern figure, 1903 to 1993. And Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik was not only an outstanding American Jewish Orthodox leader, but he was also a philosopher and Talmudic scholar in his own right. In Gensha Cemetery is buried his grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, known as the Brisker. One of the key legs of the family came from the city of Brisk, and Rabbi Chaim was known as the Brisker, and the Talmudic method of study that he invented, championed, and exists up until today is known as the Brisker method. The Briskers are remembered as an outstanding figure in the development of Talmudic learning, really shaping and adding to the centuries-long tradition of learning Jewish text with a new analytical clarity, with a new kind of conceptual precision. And today, literally entire generations of yeshiva learning can trace back the very method that they use to him, But his greatness wasn't only intellectual. He was also renowned for an uncompromising ethical courage. And one of the texts that I turn to and love is the book by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, writing about his grandfather. And the book is called Halachic Man. And in Halachic Man, Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rov, tells the story about the brisker. And I want to actually quote the story just because the text itself is, I think, very beautiful in and of itself. But it brings to life the centrality of the ethical message that sometimes when we look at the Orthodox world, we have this assumption that it's all about letter of the law, and it's not so much about spirit of the law. And I think that this really challenges that. And the stories that told that once 2 Jews died in Brisk on the same day. In the morning, a poor shoemaker who had lived out his life in obscurity died, while about noontime, a wealthy, prominent member of the community passed away. According to the halakha, to Jewish law, in such a case, the one who dies first must be buried first. However, the members of the burial society, who had received a handsome sum from the heirs of the rich man, decided to attend to him first, despite the fact that he had died later. For who was there to plead the cause of the poor man? When Rabbi Chaim was informed about the incident, he sent a messenger to the court to warn the members of the burial society to desist from their disgraceful behavior. The members of the burial society, however, refused to heed the directive of Reb Chaim and began to make the arrangements for the burial of the rich man. Reb Chaim then arose, took his walking stick, trudged over to the house of the deceased, and chased all the attendants outside, all the people who had come to mourn. Reb Chaim prevailed. The poor man was buried before the rich man. Reb Chaim's enemies multiplied and increased. And the Rov, Rabbi Soloveitchik, concludes this particular story by adding, thus have true halachic men always acted, for their study and their deeds have blended together beautifully, truly beautifully.
Another important personality that is buried in the cemetery is Yud Lamed Peretz, I.L. Peretz, an author, a folklorist, a researcher that researched oral stories that are in the Jewish community and writing them down, mostly known for his short stories. He is not buried alone. He's buried in a mausoleum with 2 other very important people aside him. One is Shin Ansky, who is mostly famous for his play, The Dybbuk, that actually I've just seen a new adaptation, very different than what we're used to. Also in Israel history, The Dybbuk is a very important play. It was one of the first Hebrew plays that was shown in Israel by Habima, the famous Chana Robina, the greatest grande dame of Israeli theater. And next to him also Yaakov Dinson, who's another Yiddish writer. All of them are clumped up in a beautiful mausoleum, neoclassical, putting a spotlight on how culture and written stories are important to our Jewish tradition. Peretz took a lot of Hasidic stories that we grew up on, maybe not knowing even that he wrote them, and rewrote them and put them into writing. Famous stories about the rabbi who goes into the woods, his Hasidim, his pupils are looking for him. They don't understand where he is, and they understand that he's picking up wood for this poor widow, and that's his Avodat Hashem. That is how he worships God. Another maybe slightly troubling story that I grew up on is the Jewish woman who was dragged by a horse by the Cossacks and was trying to make sure that her skirt doesn't flow up, and uses a pin and strikes it into her leg in order to make sure that nothing is revealed. It's a very troubling story I grew up on, but he did a good service in terms of putting these things into writing, and we still see people using them today.
And also, I think in a lot of his stories, he's maybe not subversive, but he's inverting it. in the sense of the image of the woman or the image of the rabbi, and he's challenging traditional values of modesty, values of subservience, values of what does it mean, faith in man, faith in God. He's challenging the reader to consider a question about how we ought to act. And so in that sense, there's also, I think, a very strong ethical piece in a lot of his work.
Right.
So apropos language, and if we mention the Yiddish writers, so we want to mention another Jewish figure living at the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, around the same time as these famous Yiddish writers, and that would be Ludwig Zamenhof. Zamenhof was also part of that scene of Eastern European Jewry, although not born in Warsaw, and he grew up in a place where local ethnicities and local language and the diversity of this human mosaic was very much part of the lay of the land. Jews and Poles and Germans and Russians, and you go slightly north, Lithuanians, and each group with its own stories and memories and language. He came up with an idea. He said, listen, I don't think people should lose who they are. We shouldn't erase these languages, but let's try to create a fence that will bridge the gap between different groups, a language which will be neutral, which will be international. And he called it Esperanto. And this attempt to create an international language, it didn't become as popular as Chinese, perhaps, but by 1887, you have Esperanto being taught, being adopted by some Jews and some non-Jews, mainly more wealthy people, better educated, younger people who were part of, let's say, a revolutionary drive within Eastern European life, and particularly in Jewish life. And Zamenhof eventually makes his way to Warsaw. He himself was a doctor living in Warsaw. But of course, history caught up with him. And whether it was the Russian Revolution and the crackdown on Jewish nationalism, on Yiddish as a language in the 1920s and onward, whether it was the fear or suspicion by the communist authorities that Esperanto was, again, a kind of Jewish subversive plan. And this was an idea that the communists actually shared with the Nazis. And Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about Esperanto specifically as a Jewish plot to overthrow European culture. And by the time that Zamenhof dies, Esperanto, I won't say it died with him, but it doesn't catch on in the same way because of these historical movements and the tragedy of the Second World War and of the Holocaust. Zamenhof's 3 children, Adam, Sophia, and Lydia, were all murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And if we want to talk about resilience, well, still today, 2026, it's estimated there could be as many as 2 million people in the world who speak Esperanto. 2 million is a small language, but still the question of this hope for a way to bridge human difference and to build something that is shared by all. This seems to be a bit of a red thread moving through a lot of the stories of the people that we're talking about, not erasing Jewishness, not erasing specificity, but at the same time trying to do something that would give people the reminder, hey, we all share something in common as well.
But another doctor I want to talk about, an important doctor. Personally, this is a very important figure to me, because he passed not so long ago. Dr. Mark Edelman, who was a proud Polish Jew until he died, who was a heart doctor who lived in Warsaw even post-war and is part of the resistance. The story that I grew up on, an Israeli dealing with the Holocaust with family members who live in Lochmei Getaot kibbutz, the kibbutz of the ghetto fighters. We were always told stories about Mordechai Anilevich and Tzvi Lubotkin, young Jews who understood that the way that they want to deal with the catastrophe coming upon them is to fight back. There's another part of the resistance that maybe in Israel wasn't talked about so much, and that was led by Mark Edelman, who fought with the Jewish Combat Organization. He was one of the central leaders in the 1943 revolt, and he was part of the last bunker that fell in that revolt. He escaped through the sewers into a burning city above. After the war, he made a remarkable and unexpected decision to keep on living in Warsaw. For me, as a Zionist kid, was always such an interesting, strange idea that Zionism wasn't always and the only answer. But Mark Edelman was part of a different ideology, the Bundist ideology. So what was the Bundist utopia? Working class Yiddish speaking movement?
So the Bund, interestingly, was an organization that was Jewish nationalist, centered in Eastern Europe. The basis of Jewish nationalism, according to their philosophy, was not the return to the land of Israel, to the historic homeland, but the establishment of some form of Jewish political autonomy and cultural autonomy based on the Yiddish language in Eastern Europe. By the eve of the Second World War, it was the largest Jewish political organization in Eastern Europe, definitely in Warsaw. And I think that that's also part of this interesting story, because we have this image of Eastern European Jewry as religious Orthodox, Hasidic or Miknagdik. We have this image of Zionism as the main narrative that these people lived, but actually Zionism was a minority organization in much of Eastern Europe, and different forms of Jewish socialism, including the Bundist version, was really the Jewish majority. It was the Jewish nationalism of the Yiddish-speaking Jewish working class.
But let's go back to Mark Edelman, who died in 2009 in Warsaw after treating many, many patients in his practice and being part of the Warsaw Hospital. In his later life, he had a few iconic interviews in Israeli media. He resurfaced as one of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto and had people looking at I don't know if the Bundist idea, but the idea of diaspora Jewry being a viable option differently than what we were used to.
Two other elements here, which are part of his story. One is within Poland, the struggle of the Polish nation against communist occupation. Mark Edelman was one of the people who led that, and he was really a kind of heroic figure for what became the anti-communist solidarity movement as it began to emerge in the struggle against the Soviet Union. And the other piece is that Mark Edelman, in terms of his relation to Israel, he never condemned the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, but he did make the argument in a number of interviews that the state of Israel was only hurting itself and Jewish memory by refusing to honor and help fulfill some form of Palestinian self-determination. And in that sense, he was a hard pill to swallow, both for the authorities in Poland, and I guess one could say in Moscow, and also in Jerusalem, because he was a bird who flew in a different direction.
I think his idea that saving the world, tikkun olam, is a very Jewish thing. And we have different ways of repairing the world, from Zamenhof to Edelman to Peretz, even to Sarah Bat Eliezer, who maybe just kept to her home, and that was her way of repairing. And connecting to that repairing the world is a very Jewish notion. That's where it meets all at this cemetery. Beautiful, very green cemetery in Warsaw.
Yeah. And I think that's an issue, this issue of the cemetery and what we learn from it. I think that one of the things, at least in terms of the people that we chose, Rivka, as you're pointing out, is this ethical drive, and maybe that's part of the heritage of people who saw the Jews as a persecuted minority, even though they were a sizable part of Warsaw, obviously, but also saw the Jews as a nation with incredible confidence, with a lot of strength. and the sense that somehow we can be part of changing the world, what we call today tikkun olam. I'm not sure they would have used that phrase, was definitely part of the DNA of each of the people that we mentioned. The flip side of the coin is I don't think any of them were naive, and particularly although many of these people did not live through the period of the Holocaust. Obviously, Mark Edelman did. The question of how do you keep that faith in the face of a reality and historical events that are sometimes outrageous in their cruelty, difficult in the challenges that they face for us, and really, literally murderous in their intent and consequences. How do you keep the faith in the face of a world that it doesn't always want that faith?
I think it's very ironic that we're searching for hope in a cemetery. The land of the living, searching for hope is an endless chore. And also taking inspiration and giving people from different beliefs than us the benefit of the doubt that they're doing this because they believe they want to repair the world just as much as you do. And I think in the society that we live in today, after reading today's news, that is exactly something I need to remind myself every day.
And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own. Hi, everybody. You probably recognize the voice. It's Scott. And here is my something for the road. In the context of the visit to Warsaw and the visit to the Gensha Cemetery that we profiled today, I want to offer one of my favorite books, literally a book that I grew up with from the time that I was a kid and still love today. And many times will bring it with me to Poland when I have the opportunity and the privilege to guide there. The book is Isaac Bashevis Singer's A Day of Pleasure. And for many of us, Singer is a great voice of a vanished Jewish Poland. And although this book is for young readers, it really is rich enough for adults. It's one of Singer's most intimate portraits of life in Warsaw before the Second World War. Singer wrote this book very late in his career, long after he had left Poland behind and made his home in New York. A Day of Pleasure brings him back to his childhood, to Krochmalna Street in Warsaw, the crowded, chaotic neighborhood where he grew up. What makes the book so powerful is not the nostalgia, it's the honesty of a world that's vibrant, funny, poor, contradictory, and full of characters who feel absolutely alive and full of arguments that we're still arguing today. Singer doesn't romanticize childhood. He describes cold winters, cramped rooms, and the struggles of a family living on the edge. But he also shows the small wonders that gave the world its special textures. The street vendors, their chanting, superstitions and folktales, neighbors and loved ones, and above all, the restless curiosity of a child trying to understand the universe. And maybe that's really the heart of the book, the sense of a young boy watching everything. Singer is surrounded by peddlers and beggars and rabbis and thieves and mystics and dreamers. Some are comic, some are tragic, and all are unforgettable. Even in the hardest moments, A Day of Pleasure brings a spark of humor and a sense of possibility. Singer once said that writers are really just archivists of lost worlds. In A Day of Pleasure, he preserves a world that was swept away in the Holocaust, in the Shoah, not through grand history, but through small, vivid moments, a child delivering forbidden letters for a mysterious woman, a tailor with impossible theories about the cosmos, a snowstorm that transforms an entire neighborhood into a magical kingdom. And if the book has a message, it might be this, that even in poverty and uncertainty, a life can be full of richness, of imagination, of stories, of encounters that shape who we become. Singer invites us to see his childhood not as a relic, but as a living world with its own rhythms, fears, and joys, mischief and wonder, and searches for meaning. As we wander with him through these remembered streets, we're reminded that Jewish Warsaw was not only destroyed, it was once brilliantly alive. Singer gives us the gift of that life, preserved in language,
and in memory. A Day of Pleasure, Isaac Bashevis Singer. That's my Something for the Road. Join us next time as we continue roaming through Jewish history, traveling both physically and in our imaginations. And I certainly look forward to seeing you next time on all of your J Squared Adventures journeys.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's jsquaredadventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures.
And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wondering. I'm Rivka.
I'm Scott. See you soon at J Squared Adventures, Wandering Jews.